Hi, Bill. Please introduce yourself. What's your background? How do you know Hungarian companies and startups?
Oh, thank you, Tomash. Yeah, so my name is Bill Kenney, and I wear two hats. We have a company that's called Meet, and for the last 9 years, we've been helping international B2B companies exhibit at US trade shows. So helping them get traction and scale in the US through trade shows and in-person events. The other hat I wear, we started an organization about 2 years ago called Softland Partners, and it is a global network of support organizations that help companies internationalize. So it could be companies going from Hungary to other parts of the world, or it could be companies from the other parts of the world going to Hungary or anywhere else. And so it's all the organizations, the government agencies, and the various service providers and partners that help companies in that journey and be as successful as possible. So, and you asked about my experience with Hungarian companies specifically. So we're actively supporting the Hungarian embassy and consulate, and have worked with Hungarian companies through those relationships. We're also mentoring through the input program in Hungary, and we've also directly worked with Hungarian companies with our company Meet in terms of providing the services to help get traction and scale. So we've had that experience for the last several years, and actually have met some of the nicest people and greatest people to work with in our professional career. So it's been very rewarding and very nice.
So fantastic. You know both the Hungarian and the US sides
Mm.
in some way. So, how do you see what are the major differences between the US and the Hungarian slash Central European entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I mean, this question we get asked a lot, not necessarily specific about Hungary or Central Europe, but around regions and the differences between there and the U.S. And I think there are certainly some communication differences and sort of customs differences in all markets. I think just as acute are the differences in roles. So quite often we see, if people are highly technical, we tend to see, differences in terms of, the way people communicate and so on when they're technical versus if they're more marketing centered or customer centered. So, I think in what we see that, in the work we do, that's often as much of the separation as anything. And so that's a long way to say that there are certainly differences in terms of uh, how we communicate. I think Americans tend to be more direct and have an expectation around follow-up. And I think one of the things that Eastern European companies aren't as familiar with is a highly competitive market. I mean, we're 300 million people. There's usually at least a few competitors in every field, if not, tens and hundreds. And so your ability to communicate concisely to the prospect is critically important, because they need to be able to see a reason to continue the conversation. They need to be able to see that you're different and somehow advantageous for them. And so quite often that's, I think, companies coming from smaller countries aren't used to that competitive environment, and just getting used to being able to quickly articulate your message, and a message that is somehow attractive for the receiver is critically important. So
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, that's true. I think I also experienced several similar things with Hungarian companies. But how do you see which are the most important questions a Hungarian startup must answer before considering the US market entry?
Always the most important question, I think, is why. Why expand? So what's the motivation to expand? And then of course, second, why the U.S.? Why is that particularly important? And then after that, you know, who's the customer target in the U.S. and is that customer that you're targeting, are they do they have a need? Are there enough prospects that make sense? And in our definition, I think the word prospect quite often is misused. In our world, a prospect is very specific. It is you might call them a suspect or a company or an individual that has a need. They have money and they're urgent for a solution to something. And so if they don't satisfy all three of those, then they're not. So, when we look at where what questions should be asked, we want to make sure that there's a deep enough pool of prospects, people who have a need, have money or budget, and who are urgent, in order to for it to make sense. Because obviously, it's great to enter a market, but you not only need to be successful, but you need to be successful fairly quickly, because and I think this is something that's not talked about very much as companies expand, is you only have so much time. You're going to burn a fair amount of cash, and you're also going to burn essentially relationships. So you're going to have, as you come to the US, you're going to have a certain amount of support around you. It's going to be your team from your company, and there's going to be both the people who are in Hungary and the people who may be in the US, and those may be direct or they may be partners. And then you're going to have potentially investors or some type of funding source. You're going to have customers. And in the US, generally people don't want to be your first customer. So you need to have some customers to start with, and that's usually the hardest part, is those first few customers. But in order to keep that team together, you need to have some early wins, and so your salespeople or whoever you're motivating to sell is going to need to see success, because the sales environment is very competitive. Salespeople earn lots of money, and there's always a better company for them to work at, and so. And your investors will need to see success fairly quickly. And there's just a variety of players in your ecosystem that if you don't see success and small wins, and accumulating wins, sort of reasonably quickly, then you're going to disengage people. They're going to begin sort of finding better places to spend their time and money. And so I think that's a big reason why you want to identify not just why you're going to a market, but also, how are you going to be successful and how are you going to get some early wins? Because it's one of those things that quite often we see companies coming in aiming at, we would think of a baseball metaphor, aiming at the fence, trying to hit it all out of the park, when really what you want are small base hits and to build on that for a variety of reasons.
So in an ideal situation, these questions are raised and answered. But according to your experiences, what are the major mistakes the Hungarian companies are committing?
Yeah, no, that's also a good question. And again, this is, I would say, not reserved just for Hungarian companies, and understand that our perspective is all about revenue generation. So that's the part of this. I don't have knowledge of intellectual property law or other things that you should be considering in market entry. But in terms of actually getting customers on board and sales, the disconnect between the messaging and the customer is where we see a big challenge. And again, not just so much with Hungarian companies, it's also technically driven companies, and Hungarian companies quite often are engineering based, so it can be a problem. But so we have a saying here around features and benefits. So quite often technical people want to tell you about the features of their product. Customers generally don't buy features, they buy benefits. And so when you think of what you're trying to do, think of it as a very simple metaphor around fishing. Is when you're entering the US, you want to figure out what fish you're going to catch. So keep that really simple. And there are 34,000 species of fish. So your harder job is not necessarily picking the fish as much as eliminating the 33,999 you don't want to catch, right? So that really helps get you focused. And then once you know what fish, Then you decide where you're going to go fishing. And then finally, the third step is to figure out what bait to put in the water that attracts and compels that fish to bite. And so, as we see the mistakes, it's really twofold. The ability to communicate in a way that attracts those customers, which is, it's not about you, it's about them. So number one, what problem is your customer, trying to resolve? What's keeping them awake at night? And then what benefits do you provide, not features, what benefits do you provide for that customer? And there's a whole order to how communication needs to happen here to be compelling. But it's, and the second part of that communication is not just being able to do that, but to be able to evolve the communication really quickly, because again, you only have so much sand in the hourglass. In other words, the sand is going out quickly. Once you make the decision to go, you want to make sure you get those things in place fairly quickly so that as you're getting in front of that US customer, you have the highest likelihood of conversion. You have the highest likelihood of getting them to do a demo, to do a trial, to do a pilot, to come on board. And that's ultimately the speed. But I would say a lot of, again, in our experience, it's not just about the marketing and the communication, but it's about the speed at which you can develop it and evolve it as you learn in the market. These are two really big challenges we see with both Hungarian and technical type companies.
And how can these challenges overcome? I mean, how can the risks of market entry mitigated?
Yeah, I think the really the best way to mitigate risk, right? So if you look at the investment you'll make to internationalize to the U.S. in stages, is really the best way is to have customers before you make a formal decision to enter. So, if you have clients in Hungary or in Europe that have a U.S. office, looking to get some of them to help you make contact to their U.S. counterparts so that you can begin to get some U.S. experience and some U.S. logos before you make that sort of formal commitment. I think there's a really good strategy there. And I think short of having customers with U.S. operations or maybe that are based in the U.S., identifying some vertical, whether it's an industry vertical, whether it's a geographic area, and attracting some customers in that space. And it usually when you're in the U.S., and again, it's always different when you're based in a smaller country, it's the scale of the U.S. is so much larger. You need to be very narrow in your focus, not just in terms of who the prospect is, but where within the country you're aiming at them, because you can be very inefficient by trying to sort of market everywhere. And there's no company that's generally entering a market unless it's a sort of massive enterprise multinational company that can do a nationwide campaign in the U.S. You need to really get focused. And so I would say, to answer the question succinctly, I would say getting some customers and some pilots going before you formally decide to enter the country, but to get, and I think it's both important to test your marketing message and the value proposition that you can bring, but also to operationally test that you can deliver services in a country that's at least 6 hours different from a time standpoint to 9 hours different. We're dealing with a Taiwan company right now. They're 12, now 13 hours different from the U.S. East Coast. And just trying to do demos is problematic. I mean, they're trying to schedule U.S. companies to do demos at, like 1 a.m. U.S. time. Nobody wants to do that. They want to do, in the U.S. we think the world is catering to us, and the world centers around us. So and it's going to be very hard to compel a U.S. customer to do demos at 1 a.m. And so having the ability, with 6 or 9 hours difference to be able to do demos, whether it's from Hungary or with a U.S. counterpart, to be able to do those types of things. But again, I think to answer your question, get some early customers here, because the first question as you enter formally will be who else are you doing business with, and people want to see logos they recognize. That's a huge sales opportunity, I would say.
Thank you so much for his fantastic insights. Thank you, Bill.